Hi, welcome to another episode of the Critical Criminologist. I'm Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, and today I'm going to talk with Dominique Gilliard, author of a really great book called Rethinking Incarceration that looks at questions of policing and prison from the lens of his religious studies and prison ministry. So welcome, Dominique, and why don't you just tell us a little bit about kind of an overview of the book to start?
Hey, thanks for having me on. The book really kind of breaks down to two parts. The first part really is a social historical exploration around mass incarcerations and the root of our criminal justice system. Uh, a lot of people in their analysis and everyday people really point to the war on drugs as the roots of mass incarceration, but mass incarceration really starts in this nation right after the Emancipation Proclamation. You have a 12-year period of supposed black a 12-year period of black empowerment known as the Reconstruction era. And right as the Reconstruction era starts to break down, that's where you get the first articulation of mass incarceration. So I really excavate the roots and talk about the policies that were applied and then really I would say exploited to criminalize Black life throughout the South through what emerges as the system of convict leasing and the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which says slavery in our nation is illegal except as a punishment for a crime. And so I lay that foundation and talk about how convict leasing in our nation legally exists well after most people think that slavery was abolished. Legally exists until 1921 and then exist underground until 1941, well after most people think that slavery is over. And then I talk about how the war on drugs really did take things to the next level. But I think one of the issues with the way that people think about mass incarceration is we really focus in on the war on drugs and the school to prison pipeline as the conduits that flow people into the system today. But I make the argument that there are five conduits that are primarily floating people into the system today. It's the war on drugs, it's the school to prison pipeline, it's the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities. And then there is the privatization of prisons and how lucrative private prisons have become. And then finally, a parallel war to the war on drugs that just hadn't been coined as a war, and that's the war on immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I lay that foundation and kind of really expose the history of each of those pipelines and show how they all interconnect to really funnel people into the system today. And then the second half of the book looks at the church's response to mass incarceration, the good, the bad, and the ugly, particularly the Christian church. And it shows the ways in which we have been complicit with the problem and have exacerbated the problem. But then it also shows some of the remnant who have been faithful advocates to try to end the system and make the system a more restorative, humane, dignifying place. And then the book finally, of course, ends with some kind of prophetic calls to the body of Christ in regards to what does it look like for us to not jump on this bandwagon of advocating for incarcerated people only once it's politically and theologically safe to do it. But what does it mean for us while the fight is still being waged to get involved right now?
Great. And I know you talk in the book about how prison ministry was important in sort of opening your eyes to the extent and nature of this problem of mass incarceration. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think for me, a lot of the lived experience of growing up in communities where a lot of my friends didn't have men in the house, fathers, brothers, uncles. Um, there was this kind of eerie feeling that I felt but didn't have words for. And then the new Jim Crow gave me language to articulate what I had experienced growing up. And as I came into contact with that book, it really helped me to start to engage prisons and jails in a more intentional way. And through my engagement, I learned how, society had so profoundly um, formed me in ways. As much as I was an advocate, as much as I cared, I did have uh, things that I needed to deconstruct in my own mind around who was actually incarcerated and what type of people existed behind bars. And so it was through my interaction that I was able to deconstruct some of those narratives, those harmful narratives of us and them, of people's inability to be reformed and redeemed, and their inability to come back as returning citizens and actually make our communities safer places. One of the community development principles that's been really important in my life is the belief that people who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And I think when we think about this in regards to criminal justice reform, I question if we really believe that, because our posture and our engagement with returning citizens doesn't really bear witness to that. And so right now, one of the things I get the privilege of doing is I get the privilege of teaching in a maximum security prison right outside of Chicago. And our institution, North Park Theological Seminary, is currently the only educational entity in the state of Illinois that provides master's level education for incarcerated people. And so I get to teach a master's course with the combined learning classroom with free and incarcerated students. And I teach courses on building beloved community. And what does it mean for us to see each other as beloved, despite the barriers that exist between free and incarcerated people, and to pursue a new sense of belonging that allows us to understand that we are inherently, our humanity, our dignity is inherently linked to one another. And it is through that advocacy and that relationship that we actually get a chance to prophetically deconstruct this broken system. So it's been critically important for me to be able to not only teach in the course, but to receive from the men. One of the historic problems the churches has in particular in regards to its engagement with mass incarceration is the belief that we are going to prisons to give them something, to bring Jesus to these broken people. And I've learned so much more than I've ever been able to give in my engagements through this program. And so it's been something that has deepened my faith, deepened my conviction to end this system, and has really challenged me as a person of faith who makes a lot of proclamations of faith. Do I really believe what I proclaim? And if I do, how does my life kind of bear witness to that? And so that's been something that's been really a fuel for the fire. And it would not be possible without kind of my engagement, my consistent engagement and accountability to brothers and sisters who are locked up.
You mentioned the influence of the new Jim Crow and your own thinking on this, and I think one of the most important impacts of that book has been the extent to which she was able to, bear witness in the Black church about her findings and her arguments. And I think this really shook up some of the conversations that were happening there, because my sense is, there's always been this sort of historical tension between, wanting to have a kind of prison ministry and to, try to connect with people, but also preserving a kind of respectability politics that could be a bit judgmental and exclusionary and unforgiving of people who step out from maybe what the teachings of the church call for. So did you encounter Michelle Alexander's book in the church or in an academic setting, and how have you related to this tension within the Black church on these questions?
So I got the book as a birthday present from my parents, who are both people of faith. My mom's a bishop in our denomination, so a leader. And my denomination, the Evangelical Covenant Church, actually brought Michelle Alexander in to do an exclusive interview with us to talk about what does it mean for us to be a people of faith who are on the right side of advocating for freedom and human dignity. And so our denomination actually really has been very intentional about engaging this conversation and deepening the body's understanding of the ways in which we contribute to the problem. But to speak to your question, that is a real tension. And Michelle herself even felt that tension. And she talked about later, years after the new Jim Crow, how because of that tension, she said if she kind of made one mistake in the book, in hindsight, it was that she didn't really understand the critical role that people of faith have to play if we were actually going to end this corrupt system. And when she came to that revelation, in part through reading Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman, she decided to leave her position at Ohio State University and go to teach at Union Theological Seminary. And so the tension is real, and it's layered. So I think the respectability politics really kind of flow from the desire to protect our kids, to protect our vulnerable, and it subscribes to this inaccurate belief that if Black people present themselves in respectable ways, if they contort to society, if they do all the things on the checklist, that they won't ultimately end up in the system, or they won't be targeted in the same way. And so there is this, it comes from a good place, but as you mentioned, it ultimately ends up having very detrimental impact on our witness in regards to walking alongside of brothers and sisters who are inside the system in a way that is really affirming, dignifying, and legitimate, and not rooted in paternalism, or not coming from a place of us and them where we on the free side kind of are superior and trying to help you up. But it's not rooted in an authentic relationship of understanding the systemic realities of why Black people are disproportionately locked up and more punitively sentenced for the same offenses in compared to other races in our nation.
Yeah, I did an event that Michelle put together at Union Seminary several months ago, and I remember when she made that decision to move there, and I thought this was really an interesting statement that legal strategies, legal reform strategies, were not really where the cutting edge of this movement needed to be, that these were deep ethical questions about the nature of justice, really. And I think your book really begs that question in a number of ways.
Yeah, about the nature of justice, but also the nature of humanity. Because if it is mind-boggling that in 2020, we still live in a nation that has an allowance for slavery, like literally. Like we pat ourselves on the back for being the land of the free, and one of the hallmarks of our democracy is supposed to be that people are innocent until proven guilty. But anybody who knows anything about the reality of cash bail and pretrial detention knows that that's a farce today. And we have people who are locked up all across the country who haven't even had a chance to go before a judge to determine if they're free or innocent. And so I think the questions are deeply ethical, moral questions about justice, but they're also deeply ethical, moral questions about humanity. And what does it mean to treat human beings with dignity? And when we look at realities like solitary confinement, when we know that being subjected to that has deteriorating impact on the brain to the point that after a certain period of time, when a person reenters society, they will no longer be able to function in the way that they previously were able to. It literally is dehumanizing. And so I think these are deeper questions, questions around the death penalty. These are questions that we really need to wrestle with on a deeper level, because at the end of the day, particularly as a person of faith, the death penalty says that certain people are beyond redemption. There's nothing that we can do for them but kill them. At the core of the core of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that there is nothing that we can do that can separate us from the love of Christ, and that there is nothing that makes us irredeemable. So it's incompatible theologically, not only just ethically, morally, but it's incompatible for a believer to support capital punishment and simultaneously say that they believe the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I think that's where Michelle was coming from when she was talking about the need to reground some of these questions beyond policy, because they are actually ethical, moral, theological questions at the end of the day for many of us.
So did you experience school policing yourself growing up, or was this a topic that was introduced to you in some other way?
Yeah, I experienced it. There were definitely school resource officers at our school. They weren't as intense as some of the other schools throughout the city, but they were definitely there. I also experienced my high school didn't have any windows outside of the cafeteria. And so there is this kind of socialization to confinement. And so these are very real things, but the school to prison pipeline really started to exacerbate itself after, I mean, Columbine gave rise, but Sandy Hook took it to the whole nother level. And so since I was out of school at that point, I haven't personally witnessed the intensity of the problem today, but it was already starting to manifest itself before I graduated high school.
I recently did an event up in Portland, Maine on school policing with the head of the police department and a member of the school board and a school resource officer from a high school. And, we hear this narrative, well, the school resource officers, are working very hard to connect with the children, to be a mentor, to be a kind of a source of stability for the children. But I think you're skeptical about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I think if we look at the actual role of school resource officers, we have to acknowledge that they initially came out of a good place and a good desire. When they first started, I believe it's in Flint, Michigan. The role was to interact with kids, interface with kids, to establish law enforcement as a protective but friendly source in the community. But after Columbine and Sandy Hook, the role of law enforcement has fundamentally changed within schools in regards to school resource officers, where they went from being another kind of school personnel to an enforcer of school legislation. And so the same kind of enforcement that's happening out on the streets is happening within schools now. And it's really rooted in parents' desires to create a more safe environment in schools in regards to the rise of school shootings. But the problem is that most school resource officers are not properly trained to know the difference between adolescent mischief and criminal misbehavior out on the streets. Policing hours represent 1% of training in most police academies. And only 12 states right now have any kind of legislation that requires a school resource officer to be trained in cognitive development or adolescence before they actually serve as enforcing presence within schools. This is why we repeatedly see school resource officers using overzealous force against children. And particularly, we're seeing this with male police officers using overzealous force against young girls. And so until there are some structural shifts and law enforcement, school resource officers are able to get properly trained and it becomes a requirement that they're trained before they go inside our schools, we have to realize in many cases, while we believe law enforcement and school resource officers are making our schools safer, they're actually putting many of our children at risk. And the crazy thing about school resource officers is that the earmarked dollars for them that were allocated really rose after, again, Columbine and Sandy Hook, which were school shootings that happened both in suburban white communities. But when we actually look at the distribution of where school resource officers are, they're disproportionately distributed to impoverished communities of color. So even when a problem is emerging in one community, somehow impoverished communities of color ultimately end up bearing the brunt of that problem. And so these are the systemic issues that are under the surface that have to be addressed when we have conversations about school resource officers. And we also need to be frankly honest about who's getting caught up in the school to prison pipeline. And the children who are getting caught up in the school to prison pipeline are the most vulnerable. We're talking about children with disabilities. We're talking about homeless kids. We're talking about the poor. We're talking about children coming from food insecure housing. We're talking about kids who have experienced trauma psychologically, physically, emotionally, sexually. These are the people, and we're talking about LGBTQ youth. We're talking about the most vulnerable who are getting caught up in the system. So when we have these conversations, we got to really be this. We have to be nuanced in what we're really talking about. Because on the surface, you can make the argument that school resource officers are good, but when we actually get down into the weeds, then we actually start to see that there's some real systemic things that are re-perpetuating the system of mass incarceration that are at play and directly connected to school resource officers.
And I think you also suggest, right, that actually providing alternatives to school resource officers needs to be explored too. That it's not. I'm more skeptical about the ability of that training to give us the things that we really want, and would prefer to see school resource officers replaced with more counselors, coaches, teachers, assistants, and that sort of thing.
Without a doubt, that I'm right there with you. I think it is a tragedy that many schools, particularly underfunded schools, have to make a choice between whether I want to have a school therapist or a psychiatrist or a nurse in the school, or do I want to have a school resource officer. The numbers are mind-boggling, and what we're doing is really we're depleting vital resources from certain schools because we are really putting social pressure on them to choose school resource officers over these other things that are actually important for students' discernment for their vocation. And we are actually really impairing students in their ability to flourish educationally without these other resources in play. And then even on top of that, I would even take it a next step further and say that we as a educational system need to shift from punitive practices of discipline to restorative justice. We need to be having restorative justice circles. That needs to be the framework for how do we address harm within our school system. Suspensions in school or out of school, expulsions and arrest in school are not helping. All they're doing is feeding the beast. We have to find more creative ways and community-based ways to establish accountability when violations have happened and to provide community-based reconciliation where the person who is offended, the person has been harmed, and the surrounding community has been impacted gets to speak into what accountability and restoration and reconciliation looks like.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of that spending for school resource officers actually comes out of the education department budgets. It's not like it's coming out of the police department budget. That's dollars that could directly be spent in the schools on other things. Yeah, so frustrating. I was really pleased to see in the book that this focus on immigration, which is often left out of the conversation about mass incarceration and has not really historically been a priority issue for the African American community and the Black church in particular. So how did you come across the importance of that issue, and how do you see the linkage to these larger questions?
Yeah. So I think part of what happens in oppressed communities of color is that I think you can get so micro focused on the oppression that you're being confronted with that you lose your peripheral vision to be able to see how the same systems and structures are at play in communities for your neighbor. And while while immigration isn't as explicitly it's not an African American issue, it is a Black issue. And so I think when we think about the broader Black community, it is an issue that is impacting us, and we have to kind of give witness to the systemic brokenness that we're seeing right now within our system, where, I mean, the reality is people of privilege have the opportunity to say, oh, we'll do it the right way, or, just follow the process and you'll be able to immigrate. The reality is that there is no process for so many people. And there have been people who have been in line 20 and 30 years trying to get into the country the right way, and they consistently rejected, particularly if they're coming from a country with a less stable economy. And so there's a bunch of narratives that really are intentionally propagated to pit us versus them, and to really have oppressed people be crabs in the bucket that pull each other down, or so singularly focus on their own issues that we never strategically mobilize in a way that will actually have synergy to create systemic change. And so I think for me, as somebody in my role is as the director of racial righteousness and reconciliation for the entire church. Part of what I am responsible for is helping the church develop eyes to see and ears to hear the oppression that happens across the board for all of our communities, from Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, across the board. What does it mean for us to understand that we have a responsibility to defend the humanity and dignity of all people? And so when we have this conversation about immigration, it's so obviously at play in regards to mass incarceration that it really is undeniable for anybody who's really sitting with the data. Because when you actually look at the data, the earmarked funds that have been set aside and allocated towards immigration really parallel the earmark funds that we saw allocated for the war on drugs. When we actually look at the data and we see over the 10-year period in which the war on drugs was first launched, and the 10-year period where we really saw a crackdown on immigration, the rise in incarceration is eerily similar. And so I really think that this really is, I believe in 30 years, 25 years, people are going to be referring to this as the war on immigration in the way that we refer to the war on drugs today. People weren't referring it as the war on drugs in the 70s and the 80s. And so I think when you actually do the research and you see the roots, you see the exact same growth pattern that's happening. It's just happening right underneath our nose and before our eyes right now. We haven't had hindsight to kind of do some of the analysis that we've been able to do with the war on drugs. But I mean, the numbers for Black men right now is predicted that 1 in 3 will spend time behind bars in their lifetime. The number for Hispanic males is 1 in 6. I mean, it's not this disparity that I think most people believe that it is. And most of those incarceration numbers are rooted in immigration offenses. And most of that is because immigration is so directly connected to the privatization of prisons. Because 79% of people who are incarcerated for immigration offenses are detained in private prisons. And so when you do the analysis, there's really no way to have a faithful conversation today about mass incarceration and not include immigration.
This is a really important issue for a lot of my students at Brooklyn College, because many of them are immigrants from the West Indies and even from Africa. And so they often feel excluded from these immigration conversations because there's this assumption that they're African American when they may be really American Africans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And have a great group, that's based in Brooklyn, BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. So there is a certain level of discourse about this in New York, I think, more than some other parts of the country. But one of the things my students still struggle with is this question of open borders and just how open to make things. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question, but I also think it's a question that isn't really rooted in historic fact. I think most people are shocked by the statement that the U.S. has had open borders longer than it's had closed borders.
Yep.
And the first manifestation of restricting borders is rooted in explicit racism with the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And so I think when we have conversations about borders and security, we all want security. Nobody is wanting something that's going to make our country insecure and vulnerable. But we have to have very real conversations around how race informs our immigration policies, why it is that we're so intent on building a wall on the southern border, but in the northeast corridor, there's no conversations around any kind of physical blockades, given our proximity to Canada, given how many people come through Ellis Island. So I think those are the deeper questions that I'm more concerned with and most concerned with. I think the conversations around open borders is, we need security without question. Having borders, I wouldn't open borders isn't something that I advocate for, but I would say that we have to have a tangible process for people to be able to immigrate legally, and we cannot continue to make it impossible for people who come from more financially insecure countries to be able to become U.S. citizens. Until we fix some of those systemic things, I think those are the priority questions. I think open borders can honestly become a distraction. I almost feel like it's something that people just float out there so we don't have the conversation. And so, yes, I believe in borders, but I believe in just borders and a just process that creates access to U.S. citizenship for people who have followed the process, but the process has to be realistic. And we have to have real conversations about DACA. Like, if people have been in this country for decades and have proven to be good citizens, they should be given citizenship in this context. And particularly for all these, my heart breaks when I encounter students who their parents brought them across the border when they were less than 2 years old. Everything they've ever known is that they are a U.S. citizen and they've lived and functioned as such. And then they start to apply to go to college and they realize they don't have a social security number. They try to get a job. Like, those things literally break my heart, and they reveal the broken nature of our immigration system. And so for me, those are the priority questions. And I really do think for a lot of times the conversation about open borders gets deployed as a distraction from having those more serious questions.
Yeah, I think that's true sometimes. You talk in the second half of the book about the connection between divine justice and restorative justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's a misnomer that God is punitive and vengeful and violent and wrathful in the Old Testament and becomes this reconciling, loving uh, God in the New Testament. I think that's a misnomer. I think it's incongruent with the witness and testimony of Scripture. But there's a lot of people who ultimately have those kind of juxtaposed images of God. And so when you actually look at the text in detail, you see that God's justice is not about vengeance. God's justice is about accountability that brings you back into right relationship with God and your neighbor. And so when we think about our criminal justice system, the one of my biggest critiques of our present system is that it is about punishment with no tangible plan for restoration and healthy reintegration. God's justice is always a justice that is calling us into reconciliation and restored relationships under the confines of justice. And so for me, when we talk about uh, God's justice without understanding that it's rooted in the redemptive hope of Jesus Christ and the articulation that God is reconciling all things to God's self, I think we've historically taken that as meaning God is reconciling all broken people to God's self. But the scripture says all things, which means broken systems and structures like mass incarceration, which means that we have to understand that the heart of God's justice is the heartbeat of restoration and God's desire to see things return to what they were originally created to be. And so for me, restorative justice is reflective of God's justice because it has the intention to always move beyond the harm and to move beyond punishment with the end goal of restored relationships. And so I think it echoes God's justice, but of course God's justice is deeper because it transcends kind of a philosophy of restoration. But I really believe that when part of the problem is we've been taught to read scripture poorly. When we actually read scripture, we actually see that God's justice is restorative justice with a theological truth that undergirds it, that is birthing something new in the midst of the brokenness, that is rooted in the power of the Holy Spirit that is beyond us individually. And so that's the reflection that I see, and that's the vision that I want the church to catch in regards to what is justice. Our criminal justice system is not reflective of that in any way, shape, or form. The criminal justice system today defaces the image of God on millions of people on a daily basis. We have to get a system that is about healthy opportunities for restoration, transformation, and reintegration into community with the belief that people who have made mistakes should not be forever defined by the worst thing they've ever done, and that they have the capacity to come back into our communities and help lead them into being safer communities and to see people who are going down the wrong path that they once went down and say, hey man, you don't want to do that. Hey sister, let me show you where this leads to. Let me show you an alternative. Though people behind bars have a unique opportunity to do that in ways that I think we have not empowered them to do, through forever making them kind of wear the scarlet letter of incarceration for the rest of their lives. I mean, there's all these books, serving time on the outside. I mean, it's so problematic that we say that people go to jail and prison to uh, serve their time and to uh, do their time, but then at the end of the day, we release them, but we release them as second class citizens, and we strip them of a lot of the resources that could truly allow them to have a second chance at life, to be all that they have the capacity to be now that they've learned lessons that they didn't have before they went inside. So that's the connection for me.
And sometimes that stigma that you're referring to extends to the church. You hear stories of, a wife whose husband is incarcerated who says, well, he's working in Virginia, right? Because they're fearful of that stigma attaching to them.
Yep. Yep. And so when I go and I try to teach and train and mobilize congregations that get involved in um, living into Matthew 25, which says that if you're a follower of Jesus, you're supposed to be present behind prison and jail cells. It doesn't say if you're a progressive. It doesn't say if you're a liberal. It says that if you follow Jesus, that you're supposed to be present there. And as I go and I try to mobilize the body of Christ to live into that, I say, the first thing you need to know is that to do this work faithfully, you have to you have some deconstructing work that you have to do in your heart and mind around how you've been socialized to think about people on the inside. Because at the end of the day, even if you go in there right now, you're going in there with a us and them mentality. You're going in there with some fear in your heart. You're going in there with this mentality that, like, okay, we can do this because there's still these cells that ultimately are going to separate us once I leave here. Um, but when returning citizens come home, there are no longer these barriers. And we have brothers and sisters who desperately don't just want somebody to give them handouts. They want community who's going to do life on life with them, who is going to do discipleship with them, who is going to welcome them into their home. I have a friend who's a returning citizen who's now a pastor, and he said, when I was locked up, the church was so anxious to come in there and to preach the gospel to me because they wanted converts. He said, but after I converted to my faith, he's like, they actually weren't that interested in me. They wanted to move on to the next person that they can convert. He said, I was wanting to be discipled, not converted. And he said, the first thing the church has to realize is that we're called to make disciples, not converts. And that's especially true within prison and jails. He's like, but the second thing is just as how churches need to be just as anxious to pick me up at the gate when I'm released as they are to come in and to preach the gospel when I'm incarcerated. He's like, but at the end of the day, everything that the church does and says falls down and falls apart for me if at the end of the day, when I'm released, you're not willing to make space for me at your dinner table. He said, you can't love people from a distance. It has to be authentic. It has to be legitimate. And the only way that we can legitimately and authentically invite returning citizens into our community with no barriers, fully included, is when we do the deconstructing work of actually um, taking apart this propaganda that we've been fed and the ways in which we have been socialized to fear, avoid, and look down upon incarcerated people. Because at the end of the day, the vast majority of us have made mistakes and violations that could have led us into incarceration. We're just lucky enough not to be caught in the midst of whatever we were doing. And so it's a mental shift. that is imperative if we're ever going to be part of the solution instead of a big part of the problem.
Right. I consider myself to be part of this kind of prison and police abolitionist movement. But when I was writing my own book, I was concerned about, you mentioned, that open borders as a term might be a distraction from getting into the particulars. And so, I made a decision not to use that abolition language intentionally in my book. I think the politics have shifted some. There is more space to talk about that now. And I'm wondering how you feel about that movement, that label, and do you feel connected to that community of struggle?
Yeah, I definitely feel connected to the struggle. I think there's different articulations of it too. And I think that's part of the difficulty with movement language. I think people kind of create this kind of monolith when there's great diversity within movements. And so I think I try to stay accountable to that movement. I try to listen and learn from and interact with that movement. But I also know that the way that the program that I'm a part of, it looks at abolition a little bit differently. So it looks at it in the respect that disproportionately the men and women who are locked up behind bars are the least of these. There are people who have some kind of mental impairment, some kind of substance abuse addiction, or who come from some kind of disenfranchised community that didn't have access. And so what we're trying to do is to think about education as a form of reparation that leads towards abolition. And so when we actually break down the numbers, the most cost effective and the most effective way, not just cost, but effective way to reduce recidivism is creating access to higher education behind bars. For every dollar we invest, we get $5 back return on our investment. When we look at the fact that we are providing men and women behind bars with access to something that they would have never been able to have access to in many respects on the outside, coming from the circumstances that they came from, we are actually seeing education as a form of reparations that actually has transformative power. With that said, we're also fighting and very much clear about the fact that our present criminal justice system has to be abolished. We can't tinker legislatively with it. We cannot make little, shifts. That's inadequate. The system itself is ultimately broken at its core, and there has to be a deconstruction of it and a reimagining of what accountability looks like for violation outside of the context of what it currently is, because this system is beyond redemption, the way that it presently is constructed. And so we try to hold both simultaneously. So we're doing the work of reparation while also advocating for abolition. And I think the both and strategy is very much something that should resonate with believers in the midst of the now and the not yet kind of thing. And so we're trying to actualize that in practice. And so in the midst of critique, how do you work towards the ultimate demise of a broken system while also simultaneously working to provide lifelines for people who are presently caught up in the system, and to empower them to understand that they have unique tools to help with the dismantling process. And so I think, and for me, the abolition is rooted in the conviction that our present system is antithetical to the gospel, that it ultimately is something that is denying the image of God in my sisters and brothers, and that it is treating them as less than human. And anything that is systemically manifesting itself in that way is something that I believe that we are called to help end, and to then help envision a new way, something that is more humane, dignifying, but not soft on crime, because I know that's the fear for people. Like, I'm not talking about something soft on crime. I'm not talking about just letting people who cause violations run amok. I'm talking about creating and envisioning a new system of accountability that does not deny people their humanity, and that is not rooted in oppression and exploitation of people's labor. I'm talking about a system of a re-envisioning of something completely new, because this, as it stands today, is beyond redemption.
Yeah, people persist in this myth that prison is a form of accountability, when really it's just a form of punishment. And so many people who go there, there's never any accounting. There's never any real effort or structure to get them to really come to terms with how they ended up there. A lot of people can just do their time and come back the same person they were. And that doesn't make any of us any safer, and it doesn't make their lives any better, right?
Yeah. So we've depleted prisons and jails of most of the opportunities that were supposed to lead people towards rehabilitation, like education behind bars. We have a system right now that, as you said, it just does not equip you to come back into society reformed. And so, like, one of the ways that I think a lot of people say that they see the system at play in this way is like with the workforce development programs, or the jobs that people are doing. But I always tell people, when you have people who are working full days worth of work and they're getting paid between 93 cents and $4 a day for a full day's worth of labor, that's exploitation. I mean, and on top of that, we don't even reckon with how much money corporations and industries are making off of slave labor. And it is it's ultimately kind of most crystallized when you have a man or a woman who comes out of the system, who've been working for a company for 20, 30 years, becoming an expert in the craft, and then they get released and they go back to the exact same company and they say, I got 20, 30 years of experience doing this work, and they apply and they get denied access to the job because of their criminal record. That literally says that your labor is only desirable when it's exploitable. And until we are able to, again, systemically shift and fix things like that, that argument about workforce development as a form of rehabilitation completely falls down. Yeah. If nothing else, people must be required to pay incarcerated people the minimum wage. And even if they don't get that money right then, and that's a money that ultimately is stacking on the books for them once they get released, so that they actually have something more than $25 in a bus pass, to actually have a hope at a second chance in life. Systemically, there's so much stuff to fix, and our system as is indefensible.
Yeah. I know that the book is being assigned in some religious schools, seminaries. Do you have a sense of what the audience has been for the book, and what the reception has been like?
Yeah, the reception has actually been really positive. The book is in its 7th printing, and it is, being very well celebrated. I think people say it's a tough book. It's a tough history to reckon with. but most people just have no clue, and then others feel really empowered by the theological exploration that I do in the text. I didn't have a faith lens to understand why I was supposed to be involved in the work, or how I could be involved in the work in a meaningful way. So that's been a lot of the response that I've gotten. I've had a number of younger people who do not consider themselves as people of faith read the book and actually reach out and say, hey, I'm not a person of faith, but this book really spoke to me. And also, your understanding of God actually spoke to me. If this is actually who God is, then I might be open to this. But this has not been my experience of who God is or who the church is. So, kind of, can you tell me a little bit about how you reckon with that personally? Because you named that you haven't seen this in the church either, but yet you still hold these beliefs and these convictions. So, like, tell me how you do that. How do you make sense of that? And so those have been really exciting conversations to have, and really some of the fruit of the book that I was hoping would manifest. And it's been really affirming to see it kind of play out that way.
Well, I hope you continue to have success in turning some minds around on these crucial questions. Let me just finish by asking you if there's anything you're reading right now that you want to recommend to folks, or something you've read recently that you really enjoyed.
Yeah, specific to this conversation or more general?
Well, if possible, specific to this conversation or related, to some of these questions.
Yeah, well, related to the question, The Color of Law has been really a great read that speaks to these issues, or speaks to the things that give rise to these issues, about the federal government's role in destabilizing communities, particularly communities of color. I think another book that has been good is a book called War on Our Neighborhoods. It's a book around mass incarceration, and specifically looking at it's the people who did the study on called Million Dollar Blocks.
Yep.
That was a 5-year study here in Chicago, and so they're the authors of War on Our Neighborhoods, and they kind of really deepen um, deepen the exploration that they do in that article and on their website around Million Dollar Blocks.
Right. Yeah, that research was originally done in Brooklyn, and then has gone on to influence research in other places. That's Ryan Lugalia Holland and Daniel Cooper.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I need to take a look at that actually. But that's a great approach to take in trying to understand just how unjust the priorities are when we can spend this money on incarceration, but not on trying to actually help people and prevent problems from getting out of hand. Yeah. Well, Dominique, I want to thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today. And for those of you who are listening, you can click the little round box if you want to subscribe to hear future episodes, and the rectangular box leads to other episodes of the show. Well, Dominique, thanks again, and I hope we get a chance to do the in-person visit that we were scheduled to do in March before all this happened.
Yeah, and be praying for our brothers and sisters behind bars right now with COVID. And in our program of 80, we've already lost 2 people to COVID. And so the numbers are astounding, and we are leaving men and women in a hot box, a petri dish for the virus, with very little concern for what happens to them. So when we talk, if there was ever a moment to talk about abolition, right now is the moment. Decarceration is the only logical and responsible option amid all of these studies that are going around where 92% of people tested in the Westlake institution in Indiana tested positive. In the facility in Ohio, 75% of people tested positive. There is an urgency to the moment right now, and we have to get out there, call our district attorneys, call our governors, and advocate for decarceration or some alternative form of confinement because lives are at risk.
It's a humanitarian crisis, and we've been very active in New York in trying to pressure Governor Cuomo, who has mostly completely ignored his clemency powers during his whole administration and has really not stepped up to the plate during this time of crisis when he says, oh, you know, all these lives matter except the lives of people who are incarcerated. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Dominique. And like I said, I hope we get a chance to chat in person before too long.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
You bet.